Hello everyone, welcome to today's Webinar Wednesday. Our topic for this webinar is looking at exploratory testing. Efficient testing without a script. I'll be your webinar host for this for today. My name is Benjamin Taylor. I work with Go Bigger, and they sponsor today's webinar, of course. Hope you're looking forward to today's webinar and hope you're ready to learn all about exploratory testing. First up though, what are we covering in this webinar? Well, main topic, of course, will be what is exploratory testing. We're going to introduce it. We're going to go over a bit of a history of exploratory testing so you can get a good idea of what it is. And then once we've gone over what is included in exploratory testing, we're going to talk about when should exploratory testing be used, as well as how exploratory testing is performed. So we can best understand when we should use it and how we should use it too. And then finally, to round up this webinar, we're going to look at exploratory testing in the CI/CD pipeline, as it's an aspect of CI/CD that can be overlooked. So, hope you're ready, and let's dive in. First, though, let's look at what exploratory testing is. And we're going to use a definition from the ISTQB. Like the ISTQB, there, of course, are a standardized body for software testing. That also means that they have the vocabulary that is shared throughout the entire industry. And the ISTQB defines exploratory testing as an approach to testing in which the testers dynamically design and execute tests based on their knowledge, exploration of a test item, and results of previous tests. The key aspects of this definition is definitely the dynamically design and execute, and especially, as the name might imply from exploratory testing, is exploration of a test item. This is the key aspect of exploratory testing. This is how it functions because we want to see how these work in real time, and we just want to make sure that they work as intended, so we explore them. Exploratory testing is known by a couple names depending on sort of what area you're in, sort of what business area. It can also be known as ad hoc testing or session-based testing. So you may see these terms thrown around a little bit, but they all sort of mean exploratory testing in their own ways, but it is of course up to company culture as to how exploratory testing is specifically done in your specific industry. So, where did the idea of exploratory testing come from? Well, the idea was formalized in 1988 by Sam McCainer in a book. And when he described what would become formally known as exploratory testing, they described it as run new tests as you think of them, without spending too much time preparing or explaining the tests. Trust your instincts. And I would say especially trust your instincts. That's a great way to sell exploratory testing. That's a great way to define it. Don't worry too much about preparing the tests or having to explain them away. No. Trust your instincts. Do what you feel is right. Because in normal testing, of course, we follow test plans. And test plans do have a time and place. They have a time and place in which we can use them when we're sitting down, we're doing formal testing, we're really trying to find these defects in some sort of testing manner, finding edge cases a lot of times. So test plans do have a time and place, but it isn't always time for them. We won't always have time for test plans, as we'll discuss later on when we discuss how we do exploratory testing. But also, there may be occasions in which we just don't want to do formalized testing, so that's when exploratory testing comes in. So when do we actually do exploratory testing though? Well, oftentimes, a key thing that we want to look out for in testing, and the reason we do exploratory testing, is because the test coverage metrics just aren't enough for us. Sure, we have 100% statement coverage in our suite. So we have 100% code coverage. We've tested every line of code, but as we know, that doesn't mean that the code is defect-free. It just means every code that has a defect has been run at least once. So it doesn't actually mean that we've encountered any defects. So because, as we all know, edge cases can happen and edge cases can be missed. Simple edge cases may be picked up through just component testing, but there may be some complicated edge cases which are missed and would normally be discovered through user acceptance testing, or worse, discovered by users in production. So we want to try and avoid that as best as possible, and exploratory testing does allow us to help with that. Another thing we may find is that behaviors outside of user stories are kind of ignored. There's so much emphasis and focus placed on user stories themselves that we don't always, at least from a developer point of view, we don't think about what happens if the user story isn't followed. Meanwhile, as testers, we need to think and go, well, what happens if we do this out of order? What happens if we don't complete this step? What happens if we skip steps? Because as testers, what we really want to know is what happens when the software is really used. And that's where exploratory testing shines, and that's where we have this sort of great priority for exploratory testing. So when should we use exploratory testing? Well, I have 8 situations in which I think exploratory testing is a great benefit for us. First up, exploratory testing should be used under deadlines. Sort of encapsulates a couple situations, but deadlines is a key area in which we should use exploratory testing. First, if we need to learn the software quickly. Take, for example, that you are a brand new tester in an established project and you need to learn. Because you're brand new, you don't fully understand this project. You may have an idea, you may have read some documentation, but you need to get up to date quickly so you can do your job as a tester. In that case, exploratory testing is the best way to get a solid understanding of how the software works and where you can look at for further tests. So that's our first situation. What about our second situation? Well, what if we need feedback rapidly? What if we're in a project, we haven't started our sort of formal testing for this new sprint or this new area, and the client needs updates now on how things are progressing. Well, and by now, I mean they need them in the next hour or two. In that case, well, we could spend some time writing a full test plan, creating some automated tests and performing that, or we could just perform some exploratory testing, get some initial feedback, get some initial ideas and defects found, potentially, and update the client on that. So keep in mind that if you need feedback quickly, exploratory testing is probably a good way to go. What if we're following a very older method of software development and we have no time to structure our tests? Because whoever decided the timeline thought testing wasn't a strong consideration and that we as testers don't need much time. And we don't know what we're testing ahead of time too, so what can we do here? Well, once again, exploratory testing is a great idea. This way, we can ensure that we do our best given the time and resources that we've been provided with. It's not great to have to, say, rely on exploratory testing in this manner, but it does give us a better idea and gets us results faster. So what else can we do exploratory testing? Well, we can also look exploratory testing to help us build confidence with our system. Building confidence in this way can mean we're looking at edge cases. Edge cases that may not always be looked at under individual component tests. We're looking at some weird sort of values from exploratory testing. What if we do things out of order, let's say? Because as testers, what we're trying to do we're trying to break the system. We're trying to see where that system breaks. And this can be with edge cases to find these flaws. Of course, we're not destructively trying to break the system, but we are investigating and trying to break it ourselves, because if we break it now, it can be fixed up, and so it won't be broken in production. What else can we do to help us build confidence? Well, it also helps us to aid with unit testing. With exploratory testing can, of course, just do quick load checks, quick little tests that we can perform again to ensure that there's some key functionality there. Sure, we may have performed a component test, but have we actually performed it on the full system itself when it's up and running? Maybe not. And so, in which case, let's actually do these little tests, make sure that it's working as intended. We also have more ideas where, in terms of help building confidence, we can use exploratory testing to help develop tests for later sprints. This is really important if exploratory testing actually does reveal some defects, because we found a test that reveals a defect. Then we can take that exploratory test we did and transform these into repeatable test cases for later on, including automated test cases. And carrying on, exploratory testing can also complement our automated testing process. Because exploratory testing is more hands-on, it's more manual, it's a good question then when we think about exploratory testing is to go, what isn't part of the automation so far? What aren't we looking at in the automation that we should still look at? In which case, exploratory testing and manual testing in general is how we get there. And the last key situation that I think exploratory testing really takes charge in is to help ensure that obvious details haven't been overlooked. This means that, yes, we've done all the component tests, but have we, actually sat down, done an end-to-end physically? Does it make sense? Is it intuitive? Is it how we imagine it to work? So we want to do our common sense scenarios here to ensure those functionalities where possible. Because sometimes things may just be overlooked. Developers may follow their user stories, but we don't have these sort of links between these user stories that we may need. And that's when exploratory testing really, really excels. So I've covered situations in which exploratory testing should be used, but what about when it shouldn't? Well, I have a couple situations here, and by couple I mean 4, of when we shouldn't use exploratory testing. Namely, I think we shouldn't use it when we need strong coverage or compliance in our software, because this is where exploratory testing is a little weaker. Why? Because I think, first of all, exploratory testing can miss some coverage. Of course, as in the example I gave earlier, we may have 100% statement coverage, which is great. It means that every statement of a defect was run at least once. It's a bit harder to do that on exploratory testing. And it's really hard to actually understand how much statement coverage you may have gained from exploratory testing. This means that overall, in exploratory testing, you may skip some less common branches. Maybe they have some very specific requirements to enter that branch. Maybe they require some data, or maybe it's time or something else that may skip those branches themselves. That may be an issue that you should keep in mind when you're doing your exploratory testing. Another key one is I'd say a pretty obvious one, to be honest. It's that early development milestones need to be reached first before we can start our exploratory testing. What I mean by this is very simple. We can't do exploratory tests if there's nothing to test. Exploratory testing needs a end product of some sort that we can properly explore and mess around with in order to test. Whilst regular testing, we can do static testing of requirements documents, of other analyses, of the code bases themselves. Whilst we can do that, we kind of need the software in front of us for exploratory testing to work. So if we're so early on in the project that there is nothing to work with, then we can't really explore with it. Following along, I did mention we may not do exploratory testing if there's coverage or compliance requirements. So the next situation is regulatory or compliance requirements. Maybe depending on the industry you're in or what kind of data you're working with, you're only allowed to use proper scripted tests. Maybe not only automation, but maybe every test that you perform has to be pre-checked by your test manager. In which case, you probably can't do exploratory testing, as that would break your compliance requirements. So, important to make sure you're up to date with your current compliance requirements and how you can actually test your software. If you are allowed to test your software in any way you choose, then perfect, go ahead, do some exploratory testing. But if you are limited in some way, maybe best to hold off on exploratory testing for now, or maybe just in this project in general. And the last situation that I think we should try and avoid exploratory testing is when the system we're looking at, or the situation we're looking at, is repetitive or has very clear objectives for outcomes. Because if we're looking at something that's very repetitive and we need to do lots of small little adjustments for, then I think it's a perfect job for some automation. Automation excels at these little repetitive jobs perfectly, and it will save us so much time in the long run. So let's try and stay away from repetitive tasks if we are thinking of using exploratory testing. What about if we have very clear objectives? We have some very detailed requirements that we need to check out. Well, in that case, then, I think we can probably use other testing methods aside from exploratory testing. Let's look at some black box methods, or let's look at different experience-based methods rather than just trying to use the software itself and try to get these outcomes. So that covers when we should use it and when we shouldn't. But how do we actually do it? How do we actually perform exploratory testing? Which I'd say there are sort of three main kinds of exploratory testing that we can look at. The first is freestyle. And this is the sort of stereotypical, I'd say, exploratory testing, where it is completely unstructured. The tester will take the software and do whatever they want, explore it as much as they'd like to their heart's content, and try to find defects from it. It's completely unstructured, of course, which means you can find very interesting defects that aren't obvious, or you could just find no defects because you split your attention so many different ways, or you weren't looking at this in a structured format. Remember, just because we're not using a testing script doesn't mean we're not structured in some form, which is why we have the scenario-based exploratory testing. Scenario-based basically looks at user stories or simulates user scenarios to identify issues that may exist in the software we're looking at. So our user scenario could be for how a user resets their password, for example. And so exploratory testing will look at resetting the password and doing it in different ways or trying to break the system in some way. That's a way of performing exploratory testing, and it's more focused on specific aspects of the system overall. And the last main method of exploratory testing is strategy-based. And strategy-based means we're using proper test techniques to uncover sort of more complex bugs. And namely, strategy-based is where our experience as a software tester comes in. Strategy-based means we understand the common bugs and defects that may be present in our code, as well as how we can search for them. Strategy-based testing may be to try and use SQL injects on our input fields to see what happens then. Strategy testing does need a bit of a plan to go into it and does require some knowledge. So you'll most likely find yourself doing scenario-based or freestyle-based testing. But once you progress and approach a test sort of manager level or become a senior tester, I think at that point you'll be more equipped and more comfortable to perform strategy-based testing. But how do we actually do testing ourselves? Well, there is the testing process. Because we may not have a script, but we're still proper testers. We still need to keep track of how we test. So we have a process. First up in our testing process, this is probably better related to the expert-based experience-based testing, but still can be found in all three of our main methods. First step is to classify the bugs. And I don't mean the bugs or defects that are in our code. No. I mean we want to examine bugs that are found in similar software. And we want to try and understand their root causes. Because if we can see what's happening in other software, then we have a really good idea of where we can try and find the bugs in our software. Next up is we have to create our test charters. Test charters meaning, well, what are we looking at to test and how are we going to test them? Now, this isn't a test script. It doesn't tell us exactly what we need to do to test, but let's look at our example of resetting a password. In that case, our test charter details that we are testing the password reset method. How do we test it? Well, we're going to provide a range of different email addresses or do things out of order, that kind of thing. That details what we're doing. It doesn't need to be 100% exact because remember, exploratory testing, don't think about it, just do it. So we don't need to write everything, but it should give a generally good plan. So if somebody comes in, asks, what are you doing? You can say, oh, I'm performing exploratory testing in this area using these techniques. And that's how we talk about exploratory testing. And then we have the fun part of exploratory testing, actually performing the tests themselves. Namely, in exploratory testing, an important part of it, and the part I really liked when I found out, is that you should just have no interruptions. Give yourself time, like 30 minutes, 45, an hour even, and just spend time following your test charter. Explore that section of the software that you're looking at really rigorously so you can feel pretty confident. Note down the bugs you find, just generally, but you want to spend as much time as you can with the software without worrying about properly reporting, because we're going to do that next when we look at reviewing our results. Because namely, in this section, we've performed our testing, we have our defects, so now we have to examine what defects we found and evaluate them. What kind of defects are these? What kind of categories do they fall into? What priority are they? This can be preliminary information right now, because we're not sending them off just yet, but it's still important to understand what defects were found, and create any defect reports as necessary. And finally, once we've reviewed our results, then we have our debrief. This is where we compile all of our results and compare them to our expected results. Have we found more defects than we expected? Did we find different defects than we thought we have enough information to make a good, clean test defect report for? Then let's examine those further. Let's have a look at some of our tests that we did perform and analyze how those defects came across or why this unintended behavior occurred. But we want to really have that time first up to just explore ourselves before we get into writing these results and then compiling them into proper reports. So that's our exploratory testing process. But how do we perform it, and what tools do we use? Well, the tools that we do use for a defect test for exploratory testing can be quite numerous, depending on, of course, the underlying software archetype or architecture that we are using. But let's stick with graphical user interface, as that's a very general area of software testing. And I'd say we can sort of break our tools into debugging tools and test monitoring tools. In terms of debugging tools, I know that we use some tools like Bug Magnet to assist us with our exploratory testing. Bug Magnet is a web browser extension, and it doesn't help us too much in terms of interaction with websites we're looking at, but what it does do is it provides access to sort of boundary values and edge cases that are common in different fields and areas. So this helps us with our exploratory testing, as it gives us a wide variety of inputs we can use to help test our website or other graphical user interface program. So bug management is quite useful there, just to get those edge and boundary values out and do those in real time. Then we have Telerik Fiddler, which I really like because it allows us to capture and inspect HTTP traffic live. This means we can manipulate requests and results from our web browser to the web server. Say we need specific information that we can't quite get, let's just edit it out. Let's just edit it in on the outgoing packet, or maybe let's bring it back in on the incoming packet. Let's change something there. It's really good if we need to get specific results that we can't always precisely achieve. So it's really great to see what happens there, and it's also really nice if there's a malicious actor as well. You can use Telerik Fiddler to help test for malicious actors and how much access they can get in your system. What happens if they change their outgoing request into something that may be locked behind normal users not being able to request it? Do you have an authentication method that double checks this? Maybe a good question to ask. But then we also have recording and playback functionality. That's sort of our other main group of tools. First one I'd say is probably X-Ray, which is a Jira extension that integrates very well with Jira, of course, as you might expect. X-Ray allows us to include video, audio, and screenshots for automatic captures and integration with our Jira boards. So it's really beneficial that we can better understand and keep up to date with what's happening, and everyone understands and reads it, what's happening on the Jira board of how your testing is going. If you found any bugs or defects, you can use X-Ray to help identify those. There's also Spire Capture, which is another browser extension. It allows you to record and organize your testing sessions. So you can use it to sort of capture your inputs and capture how you progressed through the different fields. And that's great. But of course, you can also go low-key, low-tech, and just use a screen recording device like I'm using for this live stream. So the important thing, of course, is to be able to show what you've done when testing and using exploratory testing for your defect reports. If you can show what you've done, then you'll be pretty good. And I know we're approaching time, so let's just quickly head on to our last section, looking at exploratory testing in CI and CD. But important question, does exploratory testing have a place in this CI/CD pipeline? To which I think it does, but not in the pipeline itself, but I think it does as if we should use it to complement our existing testing strategies. It's where exploratory testing strives. It really wants to complement what's already there, because exploratory testing looks at experimentation, creativity, and discovery. And these are three key areas that I think you can engage the whole team with. Not just for testers that should perform it, but also developers or client stakeholders. They should look at exploratory testing as well, so they can get stronger feelings of how a software is going and have a strong confidence that it is working as intended. Exploratory testing also means we can get near instantaneous feedback between developers and testers. If developers give us a finished piece of software right now, then we as testers can immediately perform some exploratory testing on it. Even before we've written our automated tests, we can get some immediate feedback to developers if we find any defects. Exploratory testing is also great because we can start it early, before any formalized tests have been created. We do, of course, need something to test, of course, so we can't start too early. But it does mean in case we haven't written our automated tests, or we haven't prepared a test plan for manual tests yet, we can still do some exploratory testing. And as testers, we should always think about the project and the system from the end user's point of view, and that's what this does. We using exploratory testing, we help to evaluate the applications from their point of view so we can better understand how they're going to use it, and ensure how they're going to use it is actually how it should be used and provides the correct outcomes. And I sort of mentioned this earlier, but if we are using exploratory testing and we do find an interesting defect, then I'd say that test can become its own automated test. So we're building up our automated and regression testing pile to have even more and better tests. So exploratory testing does have a crucial role to play in our CI/CD pipeline, even if it's not part of the pipeline itself. I think it's still something that we should implement and do regularly. And that covers it for today's webinar Wednesday. Of course, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. But whilst the questions are coming in case you enjoyed today's webinar and you are not already following us on LinkedIn, then why not go ahead and give us a follow? Oh, I see a question already. Excellent. But go ahead and give us a follow, because it really does help us out. It really does mean a lot to us as well. Considering you're watching this webinar, if you're watching it live especially, you're probably already following us. But if you're watching this after the fact, then why not go ahead and check us out? And even better, you can also check out our website to keep up to date with our available courses and workshops. Currently, we have one. We have a workshop for the Robot Framework Certified Professional certification. It is a end-to-end testing, user acceptance testing tool, and it excels in graphical user interface testing primarily, with a couple extra community-made libraries. But it also does back-end testing and has direct integration with Python. So, excellent little testing tool, and why not get yourself certified in it, in a incoming and very popular tool overall. And finally, if you want to stay up to date with everything that is Go Bigger, why not sign up for our mailing list, Grow Bigger? For us, it's a monthly newsletter, so you can keep up to date with our upcoming webinars, our upcoming courses and workshops. Plus, we also keep you up to date with upcoming software testing conferences and news from around the world. So why not go ahead, check it out. You can unsubscribe at any time, so there's nothing to lose. Go for it. So I do have a question in the chat. Quick question. Would I recommend exploratory testing to a rookie tester? I would say yes, actually. I would say exploratory testing is a great idea for a rookie tester. Why do I say that? Because I think one of the situations in which we should look at exploratory testing is this one. Number one, if the software needs to be learned quickly. And this is especially useful for a brand new tester. I think if you're someone who isn't as familiar with the concept of testing, then you should try first to use exploratory testing to get a bit of an understanding of the software. Because I think we've all been there in terms of we've had something new and you're like, ooh, what can I do with this? Can it do this? Can it do that? You know, I'm old enough, I say that like it's impressive at this point, but I'm old enough to remember when Siri first came out on iPhones and everyone was trying to get their Siris to do weird things. But that's part of exploratory testing. So that's that sort of natural drive there to be like, I wonder what I can do. And once you've found what you can do or what it can't do, that's when you start looking at more formalized testing methods. And I think that's where it really excels. But I think exploratory testing is a great sort of starting point for testing. But I don't think you should go all into it. And you do raise a good point. You do raise an excellent point. Isn't it based on experience? And yes, there is experience in exploratory testing. If we look at sort of strategy-based experiences, strategy-based testing, we do rely on experience there. So you will definitely have a quality difference between a complete new tester and a very experienced tester. but they can both find some similar defects between the two of them, and it's probably easier for the brand new tester to try exploratory testing rather than getting stuck into the weeds of white box or black box testing straight away. They should definitely cover these aspects later on, but as an immediate, get some feedback, get some ideas going, exploratory testing, I think, is really crucial for them to try out. And I hope that answered your question. Oh, good. Happy to. And thank you for clarifying that, because that is important. Exploratory testing isn't just for new testers, it is also for experienced testers. And I think you'll develop a balance of when is the right time to use exploratory testing, when should you focus on automated or manual tests and follow proper test plans. But I think that's further on a discussion for later. So once again, thank you everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Stay tuned because our next webinar event on LinkedIn is just about to go live shortly after this one ends. So I hope you're looking forward to it. We're looking at communication between developers and testers. If that sounds interesting, then I hope to see you there. I hope to see you here, I should say, next Wednesday at 2 p.m. My local time. So whatever time it is now, minus about 37 minutes for you. So until then, have yourselves a wonderful week and continue going bigger. Until then, bye.